He came to the Wilson Center from the Maryland China Initiative at the University of Maryland. Prior to that, he was American Director of the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies in Nanjing. Dr. Robert Daly began work in U.S.-China relations, U.S.-China Housing Initiative at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Dr. Daly has testified before Congress on U.S.-China relations and has lectured at scores of Chinese and American institutions, including the Smithsonian, the East-West Center, the Asia Society, the National Committee on the U.S.-China Relations, and Harrison Library. He lived in China for 11 years, has integrated Chinese and American, he has interpreted for Chinese and American leaders, including Jimmy Carter and Henry Kissinger. So I want to say that we want to give you a warm welcome for coming from Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. Sorry, I'm just going to push this up here. Before I get into my prepared remarks, I'd like to ask, how many people here have been to China? Good, glad to see quite a few. So this is the first time I've seen this film. I was watching with great interest. We did the interviews for it last summer. And what I was struck by watching it, and this isn't a criticism of the filmmakers, it's inevitable given the subject, but I worry that it may be misleading. Am I amplified okay at the back of the room? Because it focuses on the South China Sea, stern leaders and soldiers and parades and weaponry. You go to China, this is not what you see. You will meet internationalized, dynamic, energetic, for the most part friendly, not anti-American people. And what you'll be struck by, I think, is that, okay, we have these strategic issues and the pollution's lousy, but this is wonderful and very, very impressive. Okay? Never before in human history have so many people come so far so fast as in China's rise. And you feel that pride and that energy when you're there. And since I first went to China in the 80s, from then until now, I have seen tremendous improvements, even at the level of physical well-being and people's affect on the street. When I first went in the late 80s, you could still taste the Cultural Revolution. And the Chinese say, 行尸走肉, walking corpses, walking meat. Everybody sort of unsmiling in Mao jackets, the faceless masses. That's gone. You now see the masses working very hard and having as much fun as they possibly can. So I wanted to start with that, because this tends to give you this sense of a nation that is fully militarized and on the move, and it feels like, the Third Reich, and that's not it. So and I think if you've been to China, you'll know that. Does anybody want to comment who's been to China on that aspect of it, whether you felt a disconnect with the film in your own experience? Anything anyone wants to add? No? Okay. So let me then go into, we'll talk for about a half an hour, and where did Joan go?
Right here.
Joan, I always over-prepare, and I always lose track of time, so give me 5 minutes and then just cut me off, okay? But a few things that were touched on in the film that I want to come back to, and a few other issues for broader context. First, when we look at this area of the South China Sea, they talked about 2011 when President Obama announced the rebalance to Asia, and 2013 when China under Xi Jinping started to build up man-made islands. Well, what about before that? What had the status quo been? This is important because since World War II, it is the United States that has been the guarantor of peace and security, obviously such as it is, yes, Vietnam, yes, Korean War. But overall, we have been the primary strategic players in the security architecture of the Asia Pacific. We have far more hard power military assets than any other nation. And it has been that American security umbrella, together with our system of alliances, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and Asia. That security umbrella has allowed the nations of the Asia Pacific to not focus on their many enmities that still obtained after World War II, not to get involved in an arms race, but to develop economically. Because we have been there as what's called an offshore balancer, a country with no territorial claims but considerable military heft. So Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Little Tigers, Singapore, even China itself, all recognize that they have benefited from this American presence. Now, this doesn't mean that we're wholly benign or unself-interested. I'm not making that claim. I'm just saying that as a matter of fact, since World War II, this is what we've done. And even China acknowledges it. Even China acknowledges that it has been a beneficiary. Their view is, yes, that's true. We got this now. You may exit stage left. But they recognize that they've been a beneficiary. So that's an important part of the background of this story. And that, too, that presence has been part of an overall American policy that has been, in effect, in various ways for, well, depending on where you look, about 60 years, but that has been very explicit since the end of the Cold War. And this is something you need to know in terms of American strategic doctrine. And America's strategic doctrine has been that the United States needed to be, as a matter of all of our security, even right here in my home state, glad to be back in New York, that the United States needs to be the primary strategic actor anywhere in the world, if it so chooses, on short notice and with minimal casualties. Now, being the primary strategic actor obviously doesn't mean that we get to have our way. We have a very hard time getting our way. But we can be the primary strategic actor, and we have claimed that our security depended on being able to do this in simultaneous locations throughout the world, if we so chose. And this was explicit in the security doctrines of Bush I and Bush II. And a corollary of that, and again, this is explicit, this is not my interpretation of being able to have that kind of strategic dominance. A corollary was the United States should not allow the rise of any regional hegemon anywhere in the world. We should not allow the rise of a nation that could challenge our primacy regionally. Not worldwide, but regionally. That's very tricky, and we can come back to that. I don't know that all Americans are aware of this or that they want to sign on to this, because notice that this policy has no ideological or moral content. It doesn't matter whether a regional hegemon is a liberal democracy or a one-party dictatorship. The emergence of such a country has been seen as a threat to us. So that's by way of background. Okay, fast forward to 2000, now 2016, this period of China's buildup and our counter-reaction. And you've seen what's going on now in not only the South China Sea, but the East China Sea, so just north of Taiwan. And of course, we also have major security concerns, even greater security concerns now on the Korean Peninsula. So what this film doesn't quite get at, and I don't think that either the United States or China had realized this last summer when this was shot, when we did the interviews in New York. But I think that both sides would roughly agree with this now. In the South China Sea, we now have a new normal of sorts. We are not at daggers drawn. This makes it sound like we're looking down the barrels of each other's guns. No, the South China Sea has become far more crowded. More submarines, more drones, more aircraft carriers, more airplanes, whatever it may be. And so it's more dangerous. The chance of of a misjudgment sparking a conflict is greater than it was. But this new normal is perhaps manageable. So what changed? What changed from this period in which the United States, from 1945 until about 2013, was the more or less uncontested primary strategic actor in the region, and now? Well, of course, one of the big things that changed is that East Asia as a whole has become wealthier. I think Ambassador Burns said that East Asian economies collectively are now the organizing principle. He called it the organizing principle for the world economy. 60% of the world's population lives there. 2/3 of global growth are in the Asia Pacific. This is the most populous, most dynamic region on Earth. This is why President Obama announced a rebalance. And he said our interests now are concentrated in East Asia Pacific. They're going to remain there. Therefore, we need to shift away from the historical Eurocentric and Middle East-centric, he didn't say that, but that's what he meant, focus to East Asia. Our former strategic doctrine had been 50% of our military assets in the Western Hemisphere, 50% in the East. Obama's plan was that this would go to 40-60, in accordance with what he thought that our interests would be. So East Asia has gotten wealthier, but then, of course, the biggest change is what we call the rise of China. And I think that maybe we need to lose this way of talking about China, the rise of China. It's risen. It's here. So let's just say China and leave it at that. Now, despite what you see here with this heavy degree of militarization, there was a lot of talk about Chinese nationalism, their sense of their rights. Again, I want to back off of that a little bit and remind ourselves that in the main, China's rise is legitimate. It is a reflection of the desire for greater flourishing on the part of 1/5 of humankind. They want a better life. They've been through a hell of a time, past few centuries. Invasion, war, civil war, starvation, flooding, a desperately poor country, and this is, in the main, China's rise is about human flourishing. Because China's rise challenges us in some very serious ways, no denying that. We sometimes speak as though China's rise is aimed at us. It's not at us, it's for them. And so we need to keep that in mind. China tends to think that everything America does is because of them. We tend to think everything they do is because of us. I think my late mother used to tell us from the time we were little, you'd worry a lot less about what other people think of you if you realized how seldom they do. So the US and China are on each other's minds. We do think about each other, but they're not all driven by us. And so even China's desire then to use its greater wealth to build up its military and to shape its own external security environment, that too is on the face of it legitimate, very easy to understand. It's what great nations do. It's certainly what we do. So I think we need to keep that in mind because there are real challenges, but let's keep that in mind. So I'd like to come back to China's point of view on this. I think that the film was, I thought, fairly nicely balanced, except that most of the talking heads, and I didn't realize they pulled in real tight on those close-ups. You see every precancerous lesion on every face. It's really kind of shocking. There was no makeup. I mean, usually you go into a TV studio and they powder you up. Here you're just sitting in and they pull in and I need to see my dermatologist. So they tried to do that, but let's go to China's point of view. I think China's point of view, as I just said, is sort of exit stage left. If I was going to characterize China's policy on its maritime periphery, it would be get out of the way. We've arrived, get out of the way. Why is this? Well, this was alluded to, Ambassador Stape Roy alluded to this. Since the 19th century, through most of China's history, trouble came from the north, from the Mongols of the steppe. This was, if you saw Disney's Mulan film, does anybody watch that? Child or grandchild, perhaps? At the beginning of it, you see a Chinese soldier on the Great Wall, and then a grappling hook comes up over it. And if you're Chinese, that requires no explanation. Here we go again, invasion from the north. So China worried traditionally about its northern land border. But beginning in the 19th century, trouble came to China from the sea. First with the English during the Opium War, the English and the French during the Arrow War, the Second Opium War, a number of European powers and the United States during the Boxer Rebellion, and especially from Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War late in the 19th century, and then in World War II. So China's become aware of the trouble that it has at sea. This area, what they described as being within the cow's tongue, or that 9-dash line, is extremely important to China's trade, to China's fisheries, and there are also quite a few, we think, hydrocarbons in there. It's disputed, but there's some difficult to get at oil and natural gas. So China, within that region, depends on these, and I'll try not to give you too much alphabet soup, but they're called SLOCs, S-L-O-C, sea lines of communication. Basically means the routes that the ships take. China is dependent on these sea lines of communication for its energy, for natural resources, and for food. and for food. So quite naturally, the government wants to be able to guarantee the security of those sea lines of communication in times of discord. In times of peace, there's no problem. But in times of discord, they want to know if they can secure those lines. China also sees a claim on these oceans, and you got a sense of this, because of its proximity. The Chinese see this as their front doorstep. We tend, in terms of our mental geography, to look across the ocean until we hit China, and to see everything up until China as maritime global commons. China looks out from the porch and sees all of this as their front yard and is concerned about what goes on within it. China also faces a dilemma that, again, was alluded to, but it wasn't quite spelled out. It looks out from China and it sees what it calls the first island chain and the second island chain. And the first island chain goes from South Korea, American ally, American soldiers stationed there, to Japan, American ally, American forces stationed all down through the Ryukyu Islands, which include Okinawa, again, American bases, right to Taiwan, a quasi-American ally, the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Then you get to the Philippine archipelago, again, for now, an American ally, Malaysia and Indonesia, which are neutral, and then the Straits of Malacca. China can't get out from what they call the first island chain in times of conflict without being in danger of being sunk from a land base that they can't sink. This is what Ambassador Roy meant when he said China doesn't have the geography to be a great power. They're stuck within this first island chain. And then beyond that first island chain is the second island chain, by which they mean basically, if you think of the islands of the island hopping campaign in World War II, including Guam and other American bases, there's that second ring. And so China sees itself boxed in. But it also wants, within that 9-dash line, a zone of deference. China wants to be top dog. Okay? So this doesn't mean that it's going to be invading. We know the limit of China's territorial ambitions. It's Taiwan and that 9-dash line. So this is not the Soviet Union. This is not the Third Reich. They want a zone of deference. They want China's maritime neighbors to be conditioned to accept Chinese superiority and not to take actions detrimental to China's interests, as China defines them. It wants a zone of deference. And China, it must be admitted, is the natural lodestone of this region by virtue of population, history, now economic might. It's the number one trading partner of every country in the region, and it's our number one trading partner. China is the lodestone. So China believes that a Sino-centric, a China-centered East Asia Pacific is natural, inevitable, and desirable. Basically what they think. Natural means it's going to happen, so we can't be, if it's natural, we can't be morally blamed for this. This is not aggression, it's natural. If it's inevitable, it means resistance is futile. So you're better off bandwagoning. But they also, and this is hard for Americans to get, they also think it's desirable because they take it for granted that China will be a benign great power. They're a lot like us in this regard. A lot of countries say to the United States, oh, you're powerful because you're rich. And the usual American response is, no, you misunderstand. We're powerful because we are good. Our power derives from our virtue, right? This is roughly what American exceptionalism is about, right? The Chinese think the same thing. They also have a virtue narrative. And they say, we don't interfere with commerce, this $5 trillion per year. We depend on it. And China believes, as I said in the film, that it has exercised restraint. So this is what China thinks, but there are problems that China faces in carrying this out. One is that China's rise, what we've seen since the mid-90s, again, the scale and the scope, it's never happened in human history. From roughly, you could argue with the dates, but say roughly 95 to 2005, when we see the results of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. This has been called the greatest net increase in human happiness in any decade in human history. And that's probably right when we think about the hundreds of millions of people lifted out of absolute poverty. So China's rise has been very successful, but China rises late. And unlike the previous rises, Europe during the age of exploration, the United States, Japan, China, because it rises late, rises in a world without space. Okay? The Europeans took colonies. America claimed manifest destiny and took colonies. Japan also took colonies. Apparently when powerful countries rise, this is what they do, okay? And they tell themselves a range of stories about why this is necessary, okay? But it's a fairly consistent behavior. China rises in a world in which every single space on the geographic chessboard is occupied by a sovereign nation state under a system defined by international law, and in a world in which all these countries are connected through communications. So China complains about no geographic space, no normative space, meaning that it is becoming more powerful, but that the rules have already been set. The norms are set. And China complains too about no discursive space, that it cannot control the discourse, that the world story and China's story are told primarily by the West. And when China looks around and wants this kind of regional dominance, it sees the United States as the primary obstacle to achieving its goal, its zone of deference. Okay, we're the primary obstacle. But notice in that, I think this is important, because I'm going to end on reasons for optimism, believe it or not. Note that China's seeing us as the primary obstacle to its goals. It's important to note that China's goals, China's aggression, if you like, or assertiveness, is not aimed at the United States in the first instance. Its desire for a zone of deference has nothing to do with us. It's not aimed at us. We just happen to be the obstacle. We frustrate it, but China's goal is not to diminish the United States. China, as I mentioned, is really not anti-United States, anti-American. There's a lot of positive feeling about America in China. It's just that they said, again, that they think that they've got this now and they would like to move ahead. Xi Jinping has said the Pacific is a big ocean. It's big enough for both China and the United States. The American interpretation of that is that he means back off to Hawaii. Hawaii and points east is yours. We've got everything else. So this is one of the things we debate. So that's what China wants. What does the U.S. want? Well, if China's basic policy is get out of the way, I would describe America's basic attitude as let us continue to have our way, as we have under the old dispensation since World War II, where we as an offshore balancer are the primary strategic actor. We want to maintain that status, we want to uphold our alliances, and we want to defend international law. We assert the global commons. They referred to something here called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs. What this means, this is what America does as in its role sort of as world policeman. And this gets tricky because we hear world policeman and we don't like this phrase. I'd be interested to hear your views on this. I mean, the difficulty, and this, I forget who told me this shortly after I became a diplomat, but the difficulty is you say, okay, everyone says America shouldn't be the world's policeman, but who does the world call when it needs a cop? Right? So this is the position that we're sort of uncomfortably in. So what a freedom of navigation operation is if any nation, ally, adversary, is claiming territorial seas or airspace that we don't think it is entitled to under international law, that we think is part of the global commons, then we occasionally, but fairly regularly, will run a destroyer through it. Why? Because we can, that's why. It asserts the global commons for everybody and says, no, you can't either. These are not your territorial seas. These are high seas for the military, for commerce. They're not yours. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and I don't want to spend too much time on the details of this, but you only get water rights from land rights. Nobody can go into the middle of the Pacific and say, this 500,000 square miles, this is ours. Water rights only come from land rights. If you claim sovereignty, if you claim sovereignty to something that is bigger than a rock, that is an island, and there are technical definitions for this, then you get a 12-mile territorial sea. But if it's just a rock, you don't. You just don't, because it's a rock. Or it's some other kind of feature. So a lot of countries claim things that they shouldn't claim, and we conduct these operations peacefully just to assert the global commons. That's what we do. So in doing this, notice too, I just said that China's goals, China's assertiveness in this region is not aimed at us in the first instance. It's about Chinese primacy. Our goals of upholding freedom of navigation, international law, our alliances, We're not really aimed at China in the first instance either, but increasingly China's ambitions are our biggest obstacle. What do other nations in the region want? Most of the countries in Asia Pacific, as I said, they all have China as their primary trading partner. And that's been good for them. That's been good for them. The rising tide has lifted all boats. They value their economic relationship with China very highly. And China is providing ever more what are called international public goods. They will help with things like search and rescue or hurricane relief or pandemic alleviation, whatever it is. China's providing more of these. So most countries like their economic relationship with China, but they prefer the United States on the military strategic side. They're deeply distrustful of China. They know China wants to be top dog, and that means you're the underdog, right? And so they prefer the United States as an offshore balancer. So what these countries want is to not have to choose. They want the American security guarantee and Chinese wealth, and they sort of like being in the position of being able to play us off against each other. And I think that's good. That's actually a force for stability. Now what they also want, especially since the election, but not just since the election, because there were questions under President Obama as well, they want to be reassured that the United States is really committed to the region for the long term. They're not certain of that. They're not certain of that. So that's what they want. So, John, how are we on time?
We're fine.
Okay.
About 10-15 minutes.
Okay, so those are the U.S.,
We can
China.
also use those for, sorry, Robert, we can also use those as part of our question time, whatever you want to do.
Okay, well, let me try to sprint to the finish without going too fast, because it'll, I think, try to wrap it up. So those are the positions or the desires of the United States and China and the third countries. What's wrong with China's position? Well, one of the problems with it, and I would actually disagree with some of my fellow speakers here in their phrasing. China's claim that this has always been our sacred territory and everybody knows it, there's almost no historical evidence for this, and nobody agrees with China. They say everybody knows it. And it's an Orwellian, it's 众所周知 in Chinese. And whenever they say, and you say at the beginning of a phrase, as everybody knows, 众所周知, you know the next thing they say is going to be a lie. Because you don't say as everybody knows, if everybody really knows. So no one agrees, and furthermore, other countries have similar claims. Yes, Chinese fishermen have been fishing these waters forever. So have the Vietnamese, so have the Filipinos, so have the Japanese. A lot of folks make similar claims. China says that its claims are primary because it is a daguo, a big country, and the other countries are small. And so they assert the prerogatives of a big country. Their argument for why it's ours goes like this. It's ours because it's ours. Shut up. It's not a subtle argument. And it's one that other countries can also make and do. And so around and around we go. Another problem with China's claims, it's sense that it wants deference. And it's true that they analogize to the Monroe Doctrine and the Caribbean. It's true that the Chinese point out that we kind of like being the kings of our hemisphere. So, okay, right, that's a fair claim, except we're not really challenged in our hemisphere, right? Canada to the north, let's be honest. Mexico to the south, fish to the left and right. We were never challenged seriously in our assertion of, let's say, hemispheric hegemony. China doesn't have that luxury. China lives in a dangerous neighborhood. China is tied with Russia for the most land borders. It's got land borders with 14 other nations. 4 of them are nuclear. China still has territorial disputes with India, the population of which is going to surpass China's by 2040. And India's already got, I think, 4 or 5 aircraft carriers. And they're buying submarines from Russia. Just the combined populations, economic might, and military power of China's land neighbors combined surpass that of China. We were never in that position, nothing even close. And that's before we even add Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, China's maritime neighbors, and the ongoing presence of the United States with its tremendous military firepower. So China's asserting something United States-like, and I'm not here trying to defend our own hegemony or manifest destiny. It's an interesting conversation, but it's another conversation. When it really it can't make the same play. It doesn't have the same kind of power. And the U.S. does have real interests in the area. That's what's wrong with China's position. What's wrong with the American position? There's a really big problem with the American position, which I alluded to in this. I don't think we can afford it. I called for a self-audit. We could maintain this notion, as I said, that we reserve the right to be the primary, simultaneously, if we so choose, on short notice and at minimal casualties. How's that going for us? It's not clear that we can really afford this. We could afford this as long as we had no peer competitors or regional hegemons, but now we do. The real challenge from China is that for the first time, the United States is facing a country which may develop the potential to challenge our global preeminence. We can't afford it, and we haven't. I'm telling you, and this is sort of a Washington message. We have not conducted a skeptical self-audit which asks what we can afford in the Western Pacific or anywhere else in the world in light of China's rise and ability to fund its desires, in light of our own tremendous domestic spending priorities. We're cutting taxes. We need to rebuild infrastructure. You know the list as well as I do. How does that add up, especially in light of the fact that the United States, despite President Obama's announcement of a rebalance, we're constantly distracted by our worldwide commitments. We announced the rebalance in 2011. Then what? Then Egypt. Remember Egypt? Problem then, still a problem. It's just we moved on to the next problem, Libya. Then Syria 1. Then Russia, Crimea, Ukraine. Then Syria 2. Now ISIL. We get distracted. We cannot do it. We cannot keep these balls in the air. We can't afford it. We are facing a long-term structural federal budgetary crisis which calls this into question. And then China also believes, and they're probably right, that they have an advantage not only of proximity, this is their doorstep, they believe they have a big advantage of will. Of will. Do we really regard an attack on Japan as an attack on the United States? Japan sometimes wonders, so does South Korea. China prefers to achieve its goals gradually and peacefully. But no doubt they'll throw down if they think there's no other chance. Are we really going to send our children and our grandchildren to die to keep Taiwan separate from mainland China? Or to defend to maintain American strategic preeminence in the Western Pacific? That's not a great slogan. They get to say, defend the sacred motherland from the Yankee imperialists. That's a pretty good slogan. It's got a historical provenance. Is this something, are we really in this game? We need to do a self-audit which also takes will into account. What are we willing to pay? So where are we now? Neither China nor the United States get out of our way, let us continue to have our way. Neither of us can have all of what we want. So we've got to try to work together if we can. The United States faces a very tough question. China, as I say, its rise is legitimate. Its desire to play a greater role in shaping its external security environment and defending its sea lines of communication, that's legitimate. So the question, and this is a hard question, I've not heard a workable answer. The question is, what adjustments could we make to the security architecture in the Western Pacific? What enhanced role could we let China play, such that China's threat perceptions were lowered? What role could we let China play which allowed us to honor our alliances, was within, honored international law, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and what enhanced role could we give China, and this is where it gets impossible, such that China would be placated and not emboldened? That's the unanswerable question, because the United States and most of China's neighbors think that China wants the whole enchilada, everything within that cow's tongue, that 9-dash line, and that China will therefore take any adjustments as a sign of weakness and push for more, especially in light of what they see as our weak will, our distraction, our inability to fund, and America's long-term structural decline. So we face a range of issues with China in the Western Pacific, and I think of it as a linguistic, strategic spectrum. And I apologize, it's highly alliterative. It's a coincidence that all 5 of these words start with an A. Okay? Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement means, acknowledging means that the United States admits that the changes in China's wealth and status require some kind of change in the security architecture that we have authored since World War II. That's acknowledgement. We can adjust. Adjustment means allowing China an enhanced role within a security architecture that we still dominate. We can accommodate. Accommodation means that the United States pulls back from, retreats from, some of our security commitments in Asia to placate China. We can appease. Appeasement would mean that China's role in the security architecture in the region is greater than our own. Or we can abandon. Abandonment means we pull out, we are no longer the guarantor of security in the Western Pacific. We come home, we rebuild our schools, our infrastructure, and take care of business here within our own borders. So that's it. It's acknowledgement, adjustment, accommodation, appeasement, abandonment. That's the kind of decision that we have to make. And we're not even asking the question in Washington, and we haven't done the audit. So in closing, a couple of reasons to not be too pessimistic about all this. We need to be attentive. One, no real violence so far in the South China Sea. Nobody's happy with everything that's happening, but we're muddling through. Most things are muddles. This maybe can remain a muddle, as it has for the past few years. No violence so far. Again, the United States and China's primary goals in the region, as I've said, are not aimed against the other in the first instance. It just happens that the other is the primary obstacle. So there's maybe a little space there. Both countries know that they can't have everything they want, which should create space and give us some kind of foundation for a discussion. Most importantly, as I said in the film, multilateralism. It's multilateralism that saves us. One of the big mistakes we make in talking about U.S.-China relations is speaking as if they're the only countries on earth. And when you do that, it's hard to escape the conclusion that we're headed for war. Okay? But in fact, we're not. There are all kinds of moderating influences, and we need to welcome and develop multilateral mechanisms. Another reason for optimism is that the United States and China both face daunting, more than daunting, really threatening domestic, economic, social, and political challenges. And those are the primary, those are the priorities for both Beijing and Washington. Again, that's not good news overall, but it maybe keeps us from throwing down in the South China Sea. The United States and China also cooperate in many ways. We both benefit from trade. We work together on a growing number of international issues. We're still working together to combat climate change. We work together fairly well to build up mechanisms that will help us combat worldwide pandemics. We are working together in some ways on cyber, although we also work in opposition to each other. But we do cooperate, and we benefit from trade. And we both want to avoid war. This would be World War III. It could be the end of the human race. And then very, very lastly, another thing that could save us is China is changing. The story of modern China is a story of change. Anybody here get to China in the 80s? Can I say any early? Yes? Well, China in the past 30 years has changed beyond anybody's predictions or expectations. It's a radically different place. In another 10, 20, 30 years, it will also be a radically different place. China is changing. That is a reason for optimism. I would be even more optimistic if I was convinced that we had an equal ability to change and were interested in doing so. There I will stop. Thank you.
Very clear and excellent dissertation. It was wonderful. Okay, questions? Okay, Pat?
Thank you, and thank you. You didn't mention North Korea, which to me ties China and the United States together and is going to keep us there. How does North Korea fit into this whole picture?
Yep. Excellent question. I'll try to keep a short answer, but this is really a whole different afternoon session on North Korea, which we can do if you want. But because we were so focused on the South China Sea today, that's the reason I didn't raise it. But it's absolutely connected. We tend to see it in a different way. The United States, we often have too narrow a focus. We speak about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Senkakus. where there's a dispute between Japan and China. And North Korea, we tend to speak about these areas as though they are discrete problem sets to manage separately. And they're not. And China doesn't see it that way. China sees all of these areas as different instances of the broad problem, which is the regional US-China balance of power. That's the big game they're playing in all three places. So if the trite, but I think still useful analogy is to the Chinese game of Wei Qi, which most of us think of as the Japanese game of Go. It's the same game, but it's actually a Chinese game, not a Japanese game, where instead of, as in chess or checkers, going from one side to the other, Wei Qi or Go is a much bigger board, and you're trying to dominate different areas and to get the most markers on the board. That's more the way China plays. So on North Korea, we have a common interest. We both want denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But we also have incommensurate interests. China wants North Korea to survive as a buffer state. They want that. And China holds all the cards in terms of sanctions. We want sanctions to bring Kim Jong-un to his knees. We would really like regime change, which China simply will not allow. For a couple of reasons. The main one is that South Korea is an American ally. And if North Korea were to collapse, then you would basically have South Korea up to the Yalu River, possibly with American soldiers. And the last time American soldiers got near the Yalu in 1950, we know what happened. This is, as a matter of security, they want that buffer state. China's alliance with North Korea, which is its only ally, China has very few allies, and that story of saving North Korea in 1950 as a fellow Asian communist-run nation, that's to this day very important to the legitimacy narrative of the Chinese Communist Party. They can't avoid North Korea without denying the history of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, which legitimizes the Communist Party's monopoly on power today. So China is not going to solve this for us. They have a different vision of what constitutes a solution. They have to be part of the process, but we also have to be aware that there are areas in which we disagree strongly. I can say more about North Korea if you're interested, but I don't want to get too far. If people want to focus on South China Sea, that's what we build it as today. We can go back to North Korea, though. There's more to say depending on your interests. Do you want to, Joan, are you going to call people? Then I'd have to feel guilty.
Hi, Carolyn.
Place the TPP into your concept and presentation, please.
Yep. Okay, so TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mentioned President Obama's rebalance to Asia. Think of it as a three-legged stool. There's the military leg, which, as I've said, the idea was to go from 50-50 hemispheric deployments to 40-60 Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere. President Obama made incremental progress, but only a little bit on the military side. It never quite happened. And the problem is that because of American budgetary pressures, what our military planners worry about now is that even if we go to 60-40 as planned, it will be 60% and 40% of a smaller budget, so that we could end up with 40-60 and actually have a weaker position militarily. The second leg of the stool was diplomatic. This is Obama's rebalance. This one, President Obama did extremely well. It was his greatest foreign policy success in Asia. He got American diplomats and himself personally far more involved in the regional forums like the East Asia Summit and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so that America was much more involved and in diplomatically. This was recognized very successful. And then the third leg of the stool was economic, and that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it failed. I think there is a lot of blame. I think that its failure was a disaster for the United States' reputation in East Asia Pacific and therefore for power projection. I think you can put, there's a lot of blame to go around. Obama, Clinton, Sanders, Trump, all of them in different ways. I think that President Obama, began really pushing for it much too late, such that it coincided with the election season. Could have gone sooner. Because he went during the election season, it meant that the election, electoral politics, electoral rhetoric ended up defining what TPP was about. He also made what I thought was an extremely ill-advised argument for TPP. And his argument, repeated many times, was China wants to set the rules for trade in the 21st century. We can't allow that. We have to set the rules, and this is how we do it. Now, I know what he was getting at, and he thought this was the best way to get Congress to vote for him. The problem is, you say this publicly, everybody hears it, including China. And the Chinese ambassador countered Obama right away. He saw the weakness. He said, it doesn't matter who makes the rules. What we need is rules that work for everybody. Game, set, and match, right? Plus, Obama, in saying that, implied, well, of course China can't make the rules, without quite explaining why, which tended to confirm the ideas of Chinese military that the United States is out to contain China one way or the other. But then most problematically, Obama's repetition of that phrase told the whole world that they faced a binary choice: American leadership under TPP or Chinese leadership. And then America scuttled TPP. The world had been told it faced a binary choice. Therefore, the message is you better bandwagon with China because America's not in the game, right? That's what happened. And it was never a binary choice because, of course, our trade with Asia was vigorous without TPP, and it remains vigorous afterward. All TPP did was push a few pawns. It didn't change the whole board. So we've got to make up for that somehow. I don't know how we do it.
Thank you.
Okay, Pat, why is the United States not a non-signatory of the Law of the Sea Convention?
Okay, so the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. For the same reason that we don't like to sign treaties generally, including the TPP. Now, the TPP is a bit of a different case, but you've got a situation, Congress and the Republican Party in general dislikes international treaties, because when you ratify a treaty, it becomes the law of the land also within US borders. And so the longstanding argument against international treaties is that it gives foreigners a say in American law. And so I say the Republican Party in particular, what you basically got is the Republican Party dislikes any foreign treaty except a free trade agreement. And the Democratic Party really likes international treaties except free trade agreements. And so we ratify almost nothing. So we abide by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We claim to be its defender, but we haven't ratified it, and we pay a price for that. That's a very broad answer. There are much more specific reasons, but broadly, that's why.
Judith?
Yes, doesn't China own a lot of our savings bonds?
Yeah, this has been, I think, misreported and misunderstood. You hear a lot of this. China owns our debt, they're our banker, you can't mess with our banker. No. China is the largest foreign owner of American sovereign debt over the past decade. But most American debt is owned by Americans. It's owned by retirement funds and hedge funds and teachers' unions. So, and actually right now, China isn't even the largest foreign owner of debt. Japan is. They tend to go back and forth. So this has been misreported. China owns about 7% of our treasuries. About 7%. And it doesn't give them any leverage. They don't own this as a favor to us. They do it as a favor to themselves because of imbalances in their trade policy. They've got a lot of extra US dollars on their hands, and they want to park it in the most secure place, and they still think that that's American T-bills. So if they were to sell off that 7%, one, there would be buyers, so who cares? And second, if they sold them all at once, the value of those treasuries would plummet, and they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. So this has been, I think, misreported and misunderstood.
Paul?
You said China will have like radical change in the next 10, 20 years, something like that. That could include like the removal of censorship?
Well, right now, so if you look at China's changes from 1978 until 2013, it had been a story of obviously increasing wealth, but also increasing freedom and increasing space for individuals. You've seen, I would say up to 2013, even though, yes, China still has a serious human rights problem when you compare it to the free developed nations of the world. But I would have said up until 2013, and even in many cases now, this is the best time in Chinese history to be Chinese, in terms of your ability to shape your own life. That said, under Xi Jinping, you've seen a very retrograde movement, an ideological campaign cracking down on free thinkers, on media, on law, on NGOs, on the creative classes, on universities, on academia. It's been retrograde. Xi Jinping has gone very much against the trend of the past 30 years, which has been gradual but limited opening up, and is moving backward in the other direction. And so I don't want to hazard a guess as to where that goes. There's been a long-standing theory that if you let people become consumers, which the Chinese are, that the consumer middle class becomes advocates for democracy. Because if you let them choose their bath soap, you foster a taste for choice, and then they want to choose their leaders. That's a little too pat and self-serving. I think if it's true in China, the arc over which that unfolds is going to be very much longer than we would like. So if it happens, it will happen very, very slowly. The Chinese people cannot, but also currently are not advocating for greater freedom.
Sir?
I was wondering if you could comment about, I was told in a course that I took at Mamaroneck on China, that China wants this domination by 2050 or 2040. I wondered whether you could comment on that. And secondly, THAAD. You've heard of THAAD.
Right.
And I wonder if you could define that.
Yep.
Sort of, because I know the missiles and where they're trying to control the missiles is part of this too.
Right. So that brings us back to North Korea. But first, no, China has not set a deadline for dominating Asia. I think that Xi Jinping has outlined 2 decades, the 2 100s. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921. And so he's got one set of goals for 2021, and then another set of goals for 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But those goals deal primarily with domestic conditions, rather than these goals in East Asia. I've never heard they put a date on that. THAAD, this stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. These are it's American technology. It's a movable missile battery, which we hope could shoot down incoming missiles. It's an anti-ballistic missile system. These things aren't really proven. They keep getting better, but we don't know. They're not battlefield tested. So this goes back to the question of North Korea. The previous just deposed leader of South Korea, Park Geun-hye, since she came into the leadership of South Korea, she and Xi Jinping since 2013 had been working very hard to establish closer relations between South Korea and the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping made his first overseas trip to Seoul for that reason, and they'd had considerable success in building up their better relationship. America during this period had been pushing South Korea to deploy the American THAAD anti-missile system against any North Korean missiles. And South Korea had said no, because they knew China wouldn't like it. In January of 2016, Kim Jong-un conducted an underground nuclear test. And Park Geun-hye called up her now good friend, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who did not answer the phone. For 30 days, he had nothing to say. Park Geun-hye then said, I'm responsible for the safety of my people. I'm going to reopen consideration of deployment of the American THAAD system against North Korean weapons. And Xi Jinping knew right away what he wanted to say, namely, hell no. That we don't want. Now I know what I want to say. And Beijing pushed very hard with propaganda campaigns, limiting against South Korean stores, against music programs from South Korea, against television shows, which are very popular in China, to try to convince them not to deploy THAAD. They went ahead and did it. So what does this tell us? This tells us that Xi Jinping cares more about American alliances and deployment of American systems than he does about North Korean nukes per se. Which is why I say that Xi Jinping is playing a regional balance of power game vis-a-vis the United States and not treating these as separate issues. He minds deployment more South Korea's interest in defending itself be damned. Now, we unfortunately pushed ahead with that deployment in the midst of an election campaign, and we now have a more moderate South Korean president, President Moon, who wants to carry out a new sunshine policy toward North Korea. He doesn't really like that, so we're not sure where this goes, but it is deployed and operational in South Korea now.
Thank you. Bob, can I have a quick
Yes.
question?
What do you think of nationalism, not only Chinese, but Russian and Iran, and the dissatisfaction against America, and the need for a UN global order, including financial, that actually works in the modern times?
Big question. It is where a lot of these arguments ultimately point. So it's a fair question. It is true that China, sometimes working with Russia, sometimes with Iran, sometimes with Turkey, sometimes with India, which is an interesting player in all this. It depends on the issue. Have a, say, less liberal version of world order than the United States mostly wants to champion, except when it's not convenient for us. It's true. And China, like any large nation, one of the things it's trying to do is to have Chinese domestic standards for the treatment of individuals, information, and institutions, accepted and legitimized internationally as options to the Western order. That's what it wants. And again, it often stands at the UN with Russia. India agrees with China on international non-governmental organizations. India is not crazy about civil society. Iran is more in that camp. Turkey seems to be moving that way rapidly. Thailand, our ally, has moved in that direction since the coup. The Philippines, also our ally under Rodrigo Duterte, seems to be moving that way as well. So there are two questions. There's the old question about whether there can really be a global order or global law. And then there's the question of whether people have any kind of unified desire for that, or whether we're splitting up into two different camps. And of course, even the notion of world order or global government is suspect in the United States. I mean, it's suspect all over the world. It has its supporters, and it has, a large group of detractors as well. I can say, in the case of the United States and China, while we both pay lip service to the importance of multilateral institutions, for different historical reasons, neither one of us is willing to concede an inch of what we call our sovereignty to give multilateral organizations enforcement powers. And if they don't have enforcement powers, then it's just a good wish.
Can the world go on this way with growing nationalism?
Hope so.
We have one more question. Mike, was that your question? You have a question?
From an ecological standpoint, the reefs that were the indigenous reefs that are being built up to build up the atolls,
Right.
the land, aren't they affecting the indigenous sea life and it's causing a lot of harm?
Yes.
And what is being done about that?
Nothing. Who cares?
Nothing to hear.
Right.
Nobody seems to care. Okay, it's up to you. Do you want one more question?
Well, you know the time. I don't know our time. You've got the program. I'm happy to answer a question.
We
But
have 3 minutes.
Okay, quickie. I'm less comfortable than you are that China would not want to expand beyond its region of power. First of all, I think that if anyone attacked, including China, South Korea, or Japan, we'd respond within the hour. And more importantly, if they were to, don't they have satellite attempts in South America, in Africa, with their wealth, giving poor countries, they make satellites in other parts of the world, not part of the area of South America and
right.
Africa?
Yes, they have growing presence and activity on a massive scale, which includes the building of harbors, which are dual use harbors for both commercial ships, and the military stops presumably will happen there as well. And they now have a military resupply base, a military base, right next to ours in Djibouti. But those are territorial aspirations. Influence, yes. What I meant was strictly sovereign territory when I said Taiwan and the 9-dash line. But global influence, refueling stations, absolutely. And it goes beyond that. Most of what they're doing around the rest of the world is about extractive industries. Energy, raw materials, and food. A few years ago, they had bought up an enormous piece of the best farmland in Ukraine for wheat. It got denied at the last minute, but China has a big issue with getting enough grain and enough food, and they are approaching that in a number of ways, including buying lands overseas. But again, that is, I don't mean that that's not worrisome or that we shouldn't be looking at it, but it's distinct from sovereign territorial ambitions. That's all I meant.
Thank you so much.
Yes.